Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm in Hackney today. It's not a part of London I come to very often, but I think it does have some interesting history as a one-time independent village on the outskirts of the city of London. First, we're going to take a look at a pub called the Mermaid Tavern. Alas, no longer exists, but it was at one time Hackney's most famous pub. Behind me is the last incarnation of the old Mermaid Tavern, possibly stopped use as a pub sometime before the 1970s when it became a fabric shop. It was at one time called Mermaid Fabrics. The original site of the Mermaid Tavern would have been over this side of Mare Street, and that possibly has origins going back as far as the 17th century. Samuel Pepys is believed to have visited here. He never mentions it by name, but there is one entry where he's talking about having visited the pub close to Hackney Church, and there is another mention where he came to Hackney and had cherries and played shuffleboard. There is a mention of the Mermaid Tavern in 1742 in court records, and I rather like the idea of wine being served by the pint here. And then in 1811, Joseph Sadler, the celebrated British aeronaut, made an ascent by hot air balloon from here to celebrate the birthday of the Prince Regent. And that is depicted in this slightly Hogarth-esque painting. You can see it depicted on Greenwood's map of 1828. The original site was demolished, possibly in 1845, according to this plaque, to make way for a manor house, and the pub moved across the road. And by the time of Goad's map of 1887, you can see that the pub has taken up its location on the other side of Mare Street. You can see Mermaid Yard being marked there. And this slender, is it a luggage shop today, is filling in the gap of what would have at one time been Mermaid Yard. Pub number one, the Cock Tavern. Cheers from the Cock Tavern. If this seems familiar to any of you who are also familiar with the Southampton Arms in Kentish Town, that's because it's its sister's pub, owned by the same owner. So a similar kind of concept in terms of the beer and cider offering, and I think a roughly similar sort of interior. Let's take a quick look at the exterior. It's the work of Arthur Edward Sewell. We have encountered Arthur Edward Sewell a couple of times before. He was the architect for Truman's. This pub was likely built in 1930. Perhaps most notable are the panels at the corner of the pub. There's that classic roundel with the eagle in it, which is the Truman's Brewery logo, and then beneath that, the name of the pub. It's largely in red brick with some black banding. There's also two Truman's lanterns flanking the main corner entrance there. I would say overall this is a Neo-Georgian style building, and that was one of Arthur Edward Sewell's two main styles when he was building for Truman's. There are three entrances still in operation today, I believe. On the Sylvester Road side, it looks like you can still see the signage for Saloon Bar there. The corner entrance, on the right-hand door, I could just about pick out the word bar, but on the left-hand door, I couldn't make out anything. And on the entrance from Mare Road over to the left-hand side of the building, you can still read just about the words public bar. Of course, inside today, it's all opened up. So inside, as I say, I'm not sure how much of that is original from that 1930s rebuild by Truman's. Black matchboard panelling around the bar counter, church pew style seating in places. There is a piano in the corner that I was assured by the chap behind the bar gets regular use, and it's overall, like I say, very woody, wood floor and so on. Apparently there may have been a Cock Tavern in Hackney since the 16th century. Here's Hackney at the time of John Rock's map of 1746. You can see that most of the settlement is essentially lined up along Mare Street, which this pub is on. Today's location of the Cock Tavern would correspond to this building, shaped a bit like a backwards letter G, which is at the corner of an unnamed lane off what was then called Church Street and is now known as Mare Street. There is a mention in the London Gazette of 1798. That's the earliest written reference I could find for the pub. The pub was put up for sale in 1802, and at that time there is a mention of a livery stable and a coach yard, and that rather suggests to me that it probably had some history as a coaching inn. By the time of Greenwood's map of 1828, Money Lane has now become Morning Lane, and Sylvester Road is now named Grove Place, at least for part of it. Once again though, there's a fairly prominent looking building on the corner there. And you can see it marked with a PH on Goad's map of 1887. Note also the stable here, suggesting once again a possible former coaching inn. At some point then, taken on by Truman's and, like we said, rebuilt around 1930 by them. Much more recently, around about 2013, taken on by that owner of the Southampton Arms. So it now has a formidable array of beers and ciders, mostly focused, like the Southampton Arms, on small independent breweries, mostly from cask, although there is a keg offering along the other bar. There's somewhere in the region of, I'm going to get the number wrong here, but I would guess it's almost reaching double digits of the number of cask ales on. They do tend to lean a little bit more towards those modern styles. They're all a little bit sort of American style, grapefruity, Citra, Cascade, Hopsy type beers. I tend to err more on the side of the ciders because it's a rare thing to see cider on draft in London pubs. So I went for a half of the Crohn's organic cider, which is reassuringly rustic. It does have a tiny bit of outside space. There is this minuscule area out the back, which is probably used mainly more as a smoking area. And there are a few tables now lined up along the pavement on the Mare Street side, so a few of you sit out in the street. I'm sure that this pub gets very, very busy in the evenings. Nice and quiet now, of course, on a weekday lunchtime. Pub number 2, the Old Ship. Cheers from the Old Ship. I'm going to do the audio back at home because there's a little bit of background music here, but I just wanted to just get a little bit of the ambience. In a way, the pub has two frontages. First, an ornate classic archway leading into a passage off Mare Street, nestled twixt a kebab shop and a cash converters. Pause for a moment here, as this scene is Hackney in a nutshell. The arch is supported by possible composite columns. It's hard to tell, they're a bit beaten up. At the corners either side of the arch are a pair of cartouches at an angle containing the name of the pub, the Old on one side and Ship on the other. Immediately inside the arch, either side of the passage, is tiling with advertising for Courage's beer and the offerings of the pub at the time. Their snack bar apparently a speciality, and the word luncheon here seems wonderfully out of place in modern day Hackney. There's some nice mosaic tiling here on the floor. I wonder how many people ever stop to look at this. The passageway now has graffiti-like painting along most of one wall, but you can still see some glimpses of the cream and brown tiling from the same era as that Courage's tiling at the entrance. The passageway was presumably at some point in history a public right-of-way. You can see it named on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. There's a few shelves here in the passageway for drinks, so this functions as an additional beer garden of sorts, although I can imagine it might not be everyone's cup of tea. I would suggest attempting to make your way through the interior blindfolded if possible, but that second frontage onto an alley now known as Sylvester Path is actually quite handsome, and the further outdoor seating here makes for a welcome retreat from Mare Street the other side. This is apparently work of 1877, and there is a grand pediment over the entrance here bearing that date, supported by composite capitals which are in better shape than those exposed to the ravages of Mare Street on the other side. On the top floor here is a nice stucco carving of a ship. So I suppose I have to briefly mention the interior. It's rather modern and soulless and definitely not my cup of tea. There's exposed brickwork, and is that an anarchy symbol over there? How edgy. A graffiti-like mural of a mermaid on an anchor and a neon sign in this corner. There's a ceramic tiled bar counter. I suppose you could argue that's in keeping with the tiling in the passageway. The lineup on the bar, nothing I would touch in terms of beer, all pretty grapefruity, so once again I went for a cider. Devon Mist from Sanford's. It was all right. Looking at the history of the ship, the London Wiki site has records for it going back to 1816, but I'm not entirely convinced that can be right. At the time of Greenwood's map of 1828, the alley we now know as Sylvester Path was labelled simply as Grove, and if the ship had existed at this time, it would have been practically adjoining the Cock Tavern, which likely occupied a larger site at that time, if indeed it was a coaching inn. There's a newspaper account here of 1860 of aggravated assault, which appears to have originated in a drunken argument about evolution. There's a good match for the location here, and it's interesting that it was already referred to as the Old Ship at that time, so maybe there is some merit in those records going back to the early 19th century. In 1871, the landlord was fined or threatened with imprisonment for the use of illegal weights and measures. Not long after that rebuild of 1877, in 1879, a man attempted to rob a police constable here, which doesn't seem like a very sensible thing to do to me. Pub number 3, although it doesn't look very open at the moment, the Dolphin. I might have to come back later. I don't know when it opens. It might be 3, might be 4, so I'm killing time at this, I don't know, what is this sort of outdoor food court type place? It's on camera's list of historic pub interiors with the maximal 3-star rating, implying there's something really quite special on the inside. And yet everything I read about this pub suggests it's really operated these days more as a nightclub rather than as a pub, and thus the late start in the day. I think its licensing hours have recently been revised, but still not open yet. I'm not actually sure I can be bothered, to be honest, because I know despite some very apparently attractive tiling on the inside, it's not going to feel particularly pubby. One commentator wrote of this pub that it's the sort of place where you could eat a kebab on the dance floor and nobody would object. Amusing though that is, the fact that it even has a dance floor suggests it's probably not my kind of pub. So, sorry the Dolphin, you probably do have some beautiful tiling. Can't be bothered. While I was standing outside the Dolphin, I did at least get some exterior shots, so I suppose I might as well talk through those in case anyone's interested. There's still some nice components of the old signage here. On one side it says Whiskey Bonder, and on the other side tea merchant. In the window here there is the familiar Truman's roundel with the eagle logo. Much of the frontage is made up with pink granite. Don't know the exact type of granite here, as always likely something from Sweden and coastal or from Aberdeenshire. Those pink granite pilasters are topped with gilded capitals and they have faces in them possibly taken from Greek mythology, and I think the style of those capitals is composite. There's a mixture of those acanthus leaves which would signify Corinthian and those kind of curly scrolls which would signify Ionic. Interestingly, one of those pillars seems to have come away and detached itself. It's a rare example to actually see behind the scenes of one of those. You can get a peek here of some of the London stock brick and the cement or mortar there. I don't know what the fate of the bit of granite that has detached there is, and that's probably going to have to be restored at some point because this is a listed building. I won't dwell too much on the history of the Dolphin. It seems a little bit over the top considering we didn't even manage to get inside the pub. The earliest written record I found of it is from 1789 in the Literary Magazine and British Review, at which time it was called the Dolphin and Acorn. Possibly the most interesting nugget of history is that in 1842 it seems the Dolphin was embroiled in some sort of licensing dispute. Definitely not for the last time in its history, although this one seems wonderfully tame compared to modern times. It was a question of whether or not it was appropriate to open their tea gardens on a Sunday. Pub number 4, the Cat and Mutton. Cheers from the Cat and Mutton. This is a Victorian building, although there has been a pub on this site since at least the mid-1700s. Of course, the thing that jumps out at me about the exterior are these pink granite pilasters. There's some fluting in them and some other design above them. You can see one just behind me here, some sort of flourish above the fluting, and that's inlaid with black or just painted in black. Slightly unusual to see fluting in those pink granite pilasters that are so common in pub frontages of the late Victorian or early Edwardian period. On top of those, Ionic capitals, and those capitals have faces in them which look like Greek gods possibly to me, and there's an interesting running theme there between here and the Dolphin. The columns flanking what is now the main entrance at the corner are in a different style, and there is still some remnant of the Charrington's brewery livery in the windows, although I think at least some of the windows have been replaced with more modern versions in a somewhat sympathetic style. There are brass panels or mouldings possibly beneath some of the windows, a little bit obscured by the seating here now. This is not on camera's list of historic pub interiors, but on their What Pub site they do mention a few remnants of that Charrington's brewery livery inside the pub. including some of those advertising mirrors. There are also a few other somewhat venerable looking artifacts hanging from the walls in various places. An interesting, I suppose, copper countertop to the bar and some nice carving in the panelling at the front of that bar counter. Quite an unusual design there. There is a spiral staircase that leads to the upstairs room, which I think now runs as a sort of cocktail bar, possibly. That has an unusual iron ceiling and a probably reclaimed bar counter at the back, with at least one portion of that bar counter looking like something like a chemist's counter, possibly. There is, of course, a bit of a mix in between those older elements of this interior with some more modern elements, various art hanging on the wall in places. I get the sense, and this is of course consistent with many pubs in this area, that the target demographic is likely people in their 20s. It's not really trying to appeal to middle-aged men in tweed suits like me. The beer offering and the drinks offering and everything else is a little bit more geared to a younger demographic. There was just one hand pump on. It was serving tribute, so I'm having a half of this. I did a paranoid check on the hops that are in St Austell's tribute, and it's Fuggles, Celia and Williamette. And Fuggles, of course, very safe territory. Celia and Williamette, I think, are bred from a wider range of hops, and they may have some slightly sort of citrus input. It doesn't have the dreaded Citra and Cascade, so I could just about get by. So let's take a look at the history of the Cat and Mutton. The London Wiki site has records for this pub going back to 1732. At the time of John Rock's map of 1746, some buildings can be seen at roughly the current location of the pub, where Church Lane, which is now known as Mare Street, meets Mutton Lane. There is a newspaper mention of 1749 that I found about some footpads attacking a servant of Dr. Wright near this pub. It's had various different names throughout the ages. Currently the Cat and Mutton, for a time at least the Cat and Shoulder of Mutton, and various different permutations thereof. Looking at Greenwood's map of 1828, in addition to Mutton Lane, there's a Sheep Lane and a Lamb Lane, and the latter two of those still exist today, whereas Mutton Lane now corresponds to Westgate Street. That suggests to me that possibly there was a history of sheep farming in the area, and that might give us a clue as to why this pub has at least part of its name. It might at least explain away the mutton part. In 1882, the landlord of the Cat and Mutton was in court for the heinous crime of beer fraud, along with several other local publicans. They had all been mixing a sugar solution in with their beer. Richard Robert Sharp Scott, the then landlord of the Cat and Mutton, claimed it was to compensate for the fact that the warm weather had soured his beer. I don't think the magistrates were very convinced by that excuse. One note I found was that this pub was possibly the inspiration for the Old Vic in EastEnders, and there is a nearby square, is it called Facet Square, which was possibly the inspiration for Albert Square in EastEnders. Not sure whether or not that's true. Pub number 5, the Dove. Cheers from the Dove. This is almost certainly a former beer house, pursuant to that 1830 Beer House Act that licensed some pubs to sell just beer and wine but not spirits. The earliest record that I'm aware of comes from the London Wiki site, where they mentioned that it features in the 1861 census. It's not named at that time, but you can see at this address, as it was then, the head of household is listed as a beer shop keeper. So I'm guessing that this only dates as a beer house slash pub to the mid-19th century. It was formerly known as the Goring Arms, and a newspaper mention of 1885 seems to confirm that it was indeed a beer house. Note in this article the business was only being sold through the wife's utter dislike to the business. It's not marked on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, probably because it was a beer house at that time, but note on the corner of what was then called Goring Street and is now called Jackman Street. So that's probably where the pub takes its name from. On the mid-1900s map, it is marked with a PH, and Goring Street has been renamed to Jackman Street. This much more recent article gives some detail of its 1990 or thereabouts refurb. The name also changed at this time from the Goring Arms to the Dove. It was probably a bit of a rough pub prior to this. The new landlady mentions that in 1991, the first day they opened, in the space of 3 hours, they had just 3 customers and she had to bar 2 of them. Today, I think it's very much an independent pub. And I suppose in a way it is continuing that beer house tradition. It has a large focus on beer, but very international beer. There was only 1 hand pump on and all the rest of it comes from keg, but there's a lot of Belgian and other European beers on offer here. I was struggling a little bit with the lineup, so I've gone for the least offensive looking Pilsner. I think it's called Campus, is it? Possibly Belgian, can't remember. It's all right, sort of bitter and continental. Taking a look at the exterior of the pub, it does definitely give a sense of a house that was turned into a premises for the sale of beer. The core structure of it looks like a fairly ordinary, possibly originally residential house, and it has this slightly projecting frontage that is now mostly coated in this glazed brown brick tiles. Surprisingly cavernous inside. It's a corner pub and from outside doesn't look particularly big, but it has a large number of rooms inside. They were not all particularly well lit on my visit. I suppose they weren't expecting the interior to be heavily occupied at lunchtime, so they were saving on their electricity bill. A lot of the bits of the interior were fairly dim. It does have some nice nooks and crannies, and it's sort of relatively woody. There's a fair amount of wood panelling. It's not completely lacking atmosphere, I would say. That's going to be it for today from here in Hackney. I did consider one last throw of the dice, possibly a 5th pub that actually still exists today. Took a quick look at the Crown. It might be okay, but I just wasn't really in the mood, I'm afraid. I would say, well, in hindsight, we've been to 4 pubs. The Tavern definitely the best of the lot, as predicted. It is, of course, also a copy of the Southampton Arms in Kentish Town. So if, like me, that's a bit nearer to home, then not really sure what Hackney has to offer. Obviously, it's a part of London that is very much more aimed at people in their 20s. And if you're sort of, 40 plus tweed wearing person who likes old-fashioned beer and old-fashioned pubs, I'm not sure Hackney really has a lot to offer. So sorry if that's a bit of a damp squib of a video. Not sure I can really recommend going to Hackney, basically. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.